They crossed at night to a place where there was a deep cornfield, which helped them to conceal their approach to the bank. At dawn, Alexander led them through the field, ordering the infantry to use their pikes crosswise to flatten the corn until they reached uncultivated ground. As long as the phalanx was advancing through the cornfield, the cavalry followed behind. But as soon as they emerged from the ground under cultivation, Alexander in person took the cavalry off to the right wing and ordered Nicanor to lead the phalanx forward in rectangular formation. The Getae did not even withstand the first charge of the cavalry. Alexander's bold move had come as a shock to them. They were amazed that in one night he had so easily crossed the Danube, the greatest of rivers, without building a bridge for the crossing. The close packed phalanx was terrifying, and the cavalry charge brutal. At first, they fled to the city, about 3.5 miles from the Danube. But when they saw Alexander bringing on his phalanx at speed along the river, with the cavalry at the front, to avoid any ambush and encirclement of his foot soldiers by the Getae, they now abandoned their city. It was poorly fortified, took up on horseback as many of the children and women as their horses could carry, and set out into empty country as far away from the river as possible. Alexander captured the city and all the goods the Getae had left behind. He gave the spoils to Meleager and Philip to take back, while he himself razed the city and made sacrifice on the bank of the Danube to Zeus, the savior, and Heracles, and to the river itself for not denying him passage. Within that same day, he brought all his men safe back to their camp. Ambassadors now arrived to see Alexander from the independent tribes bordering the Danube, including envoys from Cyrmus, the king of the Triballians, and envoys came also from the Celts who lived by the Ionian Gulf. These Celts were big in body and had a big opinion of themselves. All the envoys professed to have come in a desire for friendship with Alexander, and with all he exchanged reciprocal assurances. He did ask the Celts what they feared most in the world, hoping that his own great name had reached as far as the Celts and yet further, and that they would say that they feared him more than anything else. Their answer came as a disappointment. Living as they did in an inaccessible country far away from Alexander, and seeing that his ambition lay elsewhere, they replied that their greatest fear was the sky falling on them. Their embassy to Alexander was prompted by admiration for him, but with no element of fear or self interest. Even so, he declared friendship with the Celts too, simply remarking that Celts were a pretentious lot. He then advanced towards the territory of the Agrianians and Paeonians. Here, messengers came with the news that Cletus, the son of Bardylus, had revolted and that Glaucius, king of the Taulantians, had joined him. They also reported that the Autariates intended to attack him on his march. In view of all this, Alexander determined to move at speed. Langaris, the king of the Agrianians, had been openly in favor of Alexander even during Philip's lifetime, had visited him on a personal embassy, and was in attendance at this time with his foot guards, the finest and best armed troops he had under him. When he heard that Alexander wanted to know who the Autariates were and how strong in numbers, he told him not to give them a thought. They were the least warlike of the tribes in the area. He himself would invade their land, so they would have something of their own to worry about. With Alexander's sanction, he did invade and set about ravaging their territory. So the Autariates were kept occupied with troubles at home, and Langaris received high honor from Alexander, including the gifts regarded as the most prestigious at the Macedonian court. Alexander even promised to marry his sister, Sina, to Langaris when he came to Pella. But on his return home, Langaris fell ill and died. Alexander now marched along the river Erigon, making for the city of Pelium, which Cletus had taken and occupied as the most strongly fortified in the region. On his arrival, he made camp by the river Iordacus and planned to assault the wall on the following day. The forces with Cletus occupied the ring of thickly wooded heights which commanded the city, so they could attack the Macedonians from all sides if an assault was made. But as yet, Cletus lacked the support of Glaucius, the king of the Taulantians. Alexander advanced on the city. The enemy sacrificed 3 boys, 3 girls, and 3 black rams, then charged down to meet the Macedonians at close quarters. But once the engagement began, They abandoned the positions they had occupied, strong though these were, and the bodies of their sacrificial victims were found still lying there. On this day, then, Alexander confined them inside the city, camped close by the wall, and proposed to blockade them with a circumvallation. But on the next day, Glaucius, the king of the Taulantians, arrived with a large force. Alexander now recognized that he could not take the city with his present forces. Large number of fighting men had taken refuge inside, and there were large numbers with Glaucius ready to attack him if he assaulted the wall. He sent Philotas up to find food, telling him to take the baggage animals from the camp and as many cavalry as he needed for protection. Glaucius learnt of this foraging expedition and set out to attack Philotas and his party, occupying the high ground which ringed the plain where they would be gathering the foodstuff. When it was reported to Alexander that there was danger for the cavalry and baggage animals if they were overtaken by night, he marched out at speed to their rescue, taking with him the foot guards, the archers, the Agrianians, and some 400 cavalry. He left the rest of his troops where they were close by the city, as the risk of withdrawing the whole army was that the enemy in the city could break out and join forces with Glaucius. In fact, when Glaucius became aware of Alexander's approach, he abandoned the heights he had occupied, and Philotas' party was brought safely back to the camp. It still seemed that the troops with Cletus and Glaucius had Alexander caught in a difficult position. They occupied the commanding heights with large numbers of cavalry, javelin men, and slingers, and a good force of hoplites. The men in the city were ready to attack Alexander's army as it withdrew, and it could be seen that the ground through which Alexander had to pass was narrow and wooded, bounded on one side by the river and on the other by a high mountain with a precipitous face, so that the army would not have been able to get through even just four abreast. In this situation, Alexander arranged his forces with a phalanx 120 files deep and 200 cavalry posted on either wing. He ordered complete silence and an instant response to commands. He first signaled spears upright to the hoplites, then at another sign he had them lower their spears to the ready and swing the mast points in coordination right and left. He now moved the entire phalanx forward at a smart pace, executing wheels on each wing alternately. After putting it through this rapid series of different maneuvers, he formed the phalanx in wedge shape on the left and led it to the attack. All this while, the enemy had been watching the speed and precision of the drill with amazement, and now they did not meet to stay. All this while, the enemy had been watching the speed and precision of the drill with amazement, and now they did not stay to meet the advance of Alexander's troops. All this while, the enemy had been watching the speed and precision of the drill with amazement, and now they did not stay to meet the advance of Alexander's troops, but fell back from the first line of hills. Alexander now ordered the Macedonians to raise their battle shout and beat their spears on their shields. The Taulantians were yet more terrified by this din and hastily withdrew their forces to the city. Seeing that a small group of the enemy had taken position on a hill along his intended route, Alexander ordered his bodyguards and the companions with him to take up shields, mount their horses, and ride to the hill. If when they got there they encountered resistance from the enemy occupying the place, half of them should dismount and fight on foot in between their mounted colleagues. In fact, when they saw this move by Alexander, the enemy abandoned the hill and took themselves off to the mountains on either side. At this, Alexander seized the hill with his companions and sent for the Agrianians and the archers, to a total of 2,000. He ordered the foot guards to ford the river, followed by the rest of the Macedonians in their detachments. Once across, each detachment should rest left, so when all had crossed the phalanx would immediately present a solid line. He himself kept a covering watch from the hill for any enemy movement. Seeing the force crossing, the enemy did charge down the mountains to attack the men with Alexander, who would be the last to withdraw. Alexander let them get close, then rushed them with his own company while the main phalanx raised the battle shout and prepared to attack them through the river. Faced by this concerted onslaught, the enemy broke away and fell back. In this interval, Alexander brought the Agrianians and the archer down to the river at the double. He himself got across ahead of them, and when he saw the enemy closing in on the hindmost, he had the catapults set up on the far bank and ordered fire at maximum range of all the missiles they could discharge. The archers had begun to cross, and he ordered them too to shoot from midstream. Glaucius's troops would not venture within range, and meanwhile the Macedonians crossed the river safely, and not one of them died in the withdrawal. On the third day after this, Alexander learned that the troops with Cletus and Glaucius were camped in disorderly fashion. No sentry post regularly manned, no palisade or ditch to protect them, presumably on the assumption that Alexander had taken fright and disappeared, and the line of encampment dangerously extended. Taking with him the foot guards, the Agrianians, the archers, and the brigades of Perdiccas and Caenis, he crossed the river under cover of night, undetected so far. He had left instructions for the rest of the army to follow, but seeing the immediate opportunity for an attack, he did not wait for all his forces to gather, but sent in the archers and the Agrianians. Catching the enemy by surprise and attacking in deep column formation designed to cause maximum impact at their weakest point, Alexander's men killed some of them still in their beds and easily rounded up those who attempted to escape. The result was that large numbers were caught and killed on the spot, and many more in the chaotic and panic stricken flight. Quite a few were also taken alive. Alexander's troops kept up the pursuit of the Taulantians as far as the mountains. Any who escaped only survived by throwing away their arms. Cletus first took refuge in the city, but then set fire to it and left to find asylum with Glaucius and the Taulantians.